Hi and welcome to the reassembly of the Sicura chronograph. Initially, before assembling anything, I apply a little lubricant to the fixed time setting pinion, which is riveted in place on the main plate, and then the keyless works are assembled, remembering that these are fitted to the upper side and not the dial side. So the yoke is put in place and grease applied to the contact points. The winding pinion and sliding pinion or clutch are greased and placed accordingly. And next up is the setting lever, which screws into place. In this particular instance, on some 8420 movements, the setting lever is merely sat in place on a pin, and then a spring assembly is screwed down afterwards over these. Here we place the train of wheels. Unfortunately, I was off screen for placing the Escape fourth and second wheel, so apologies for that. And there you just saw me placing the third wheel, and then the 3/4 bridge sits on top of these, and you carefully place this and then jiggle in the pivots, which can be a little fiddly and time consuming, and this is the case with most pin pallet movements. But once they're in, they are nice and secure and they spin quite freely. Here I'm just using an old oiler, which I keep specifically for poking and prying purposes, for awkward tight little spaces such as wiggling in the pivots of train wheels. Keeping slight pressure on the bridge, we can then add the screws, checking that the train is free. The screw that fits nearest the stem is the tall one with the slot in it, and this is the one that the chronograph bridge locates into. And the third screw, of course, is the one which holds the balance cock in place. These two will hold the bridge securely enough meanwhile. And there you can see I'm just checking that the train spins freely. And there I was, although it's a little bit out of focus, apologies there, but that was a little bit of lubrication to the effectively the cannon pinion, which is part of the mainspring barrel. That's what provides the friction for hand setting. The barrel with the new spring is put into place, and then the post is greased and slid into place. This goes in a specific way. One end has a very fine, a thinner end piece, like a notch as it were, and that goes in facing down. Once we're happy that the train's running nice and freely, we can go ahead and install the pallet fork and the pallet cock, which is a very simple flat piece of metal with a jewel, two dimples to locate it in place, and held by a single screw. I now add a little bit of wind and lubricate the pins, in this case with a little 9415, which may be overkill for a pin pallet movement, but it certainly won't hurt anything. Some people alternately lubricate every sort of third tooth of the escape wheel on pin pallets. I tend to lubricate the pin of the exit and work that through 3 or 4 turns, and then lubricate again, and do that about 3 times to get even lubrication throughout the escape wheel. And here I'm oiling the train jewels and then placing the balance. The balances on these are a little bit fiddly to get into place. It's kind of like wiggling the balance wheel through a maze of bits and pieces to get it to drop into place. So, and you do have to be careful, because being an 18,000 VPH movement, the hairspring on these is quite fine and can be easily damaged and kinked and bent if you're not careful. And there you can see we've got a heartbeat, and it's always nice when you get to this stage and the balance starts to swing nicely. As usual, this is just with a couple of winds on the mainspring barrel. I like to do this initially when placing the balance, because that will show up any low amplitude problems from the get-go, rather than putting a full wind on the mainspring and placing the balance in and finding out that you might have amplitude problems later on. And there I'm just moving a fibre which found its way up there. The end stones of the balance are removed and lubricated and replaced, as you can see here. This is done for both sides, and in this case this has an Incablock type spring rather than a KIF type or trio type, which is commonly seen on these pin pallet movements. Somewhat fiddly to locate, a little bit more so than your typical Incablock, but certainly better than the KIF or trio type, or easier rather, as any hinged ones are. And with those oiled, I can fully wind the movement. At this point here, I'm taking a moment just to demonstrate the reassembly of the chronograph start, stop and run functions. Down here we have the stop lever, which is formed of 2 components. So this bit which fits over the post itself is made up of the central screw for the 3/4 bridge. And it's raised and it has a notch in the side, which hopefully you can see there, and that forms a holding point for the chronograph bridge, which I'll show you in a moment. So you have this post here, you then have the hammer, the double hammer, which is shaped like this, can only fit on one way, so you cannot physically get this the wrong way. So we add a bit of grease here, and we add some grease here, then the coupling clutch, which sits here. So we need some grease here on the contact point, some grease on the pivot there, and some grease here on the contact point, and also a tiny spot of grease down here where it contacts the heel of the stop lever. And then the start lever sits on here, We need a bit of grease on this sliding pivot point here and on the contact face here, this little pointed section. And I'm showing you this separately rather than as an assembly because this is fiddly to get into place and greased and not fall off, especially the start lever, which balances very precariously. Following this, once everything is greased and in place, we do not fit the spring at this point because everything will just fly everywhere. At this point you take the chronograph bridge, noting the cutout there just above the Swiss 17 jewel, and that cutout slots into the this extended screw from the 3/4 bridge, and then it fits over these two, and then these two screws are fitted in place. Once we've got the chronograph bridge on, the levers and coupling clutch and everything else is functional. At this point we can add the minute wheel, the intermediate wheel and the chronograph runner, not forgetting the small, the tiny washer which acts as a bearing for the chronograph runner, which must be sat there with a tiny spot of 9 to 10 on. And once that's all there and we're happy with it, we can go ahead and fit the wheel which fits on the extended pivot of the 4th wheel, which drives the chronograph. So hopefully that's clear enough. As I say, this is quite tricky and needs a little bit of careful balance, and I know it's just going to be really tricky for me to try and capture on film. I'm actually going to have to adjust my camera angle again. I've been trying a different angle, but unfortunately it's just not working for me because it means my tripod is now currently in the way of my arms, which is really awkward. I think I need to look at an alternative method of mounting the camera on the bench to allow me to get some more usable angles where I'm not likely to obstruct the view, and also to give me ample elbow room. So after fitting and greasing the chronograph components and fitting the chronograph bridge, we can then go ahead and fit the tensioning spring, which is an L shape or an extreme V shape if you like, and this fits in the orientation that you can see here. It's a little fiddly to get into place, but you can wiggle one side in, as you can see I'm doing here. The elbow of the V fits around the post, and then the other side is slotted into place, which I'm kind of obscuring a little bit because I'm holding that with my finger to make sure it doesn't ping away, and hopefully you'll be able to see how that sits. And the beauty of the design of this is such that you can grease it once it's in place, but there I'm demonstrating the shape of the spring and how that sits. With that in place, the levers are now functional, and we can go ahead and grease and fit the chronograph wheels. So here's the minute wheel. The heart cam of both wheels is greased using my pegwood method, which is a piece of pegwood which is soaked in grease and it's rubbed across the surface of the hearts. This is how I was taught long ago, and it's a method that serves me well. There are some exceptions like the Seiko 6139 and 6138 where you physically cannot get to the heart because it's sandwiched between other components. In that case I would apply a very tiny amount of D5 using an oiler, and I apply a little bit of grease onto the faces of the hammer. Here I'm just adding a little 9010 to the shaft of the chronograph runner, and a tiny spot of 9010 onto the little washer that was previously mentioned, which acts as a bearing for the chronograph runner. And ordinarily I would have done this prior to doing the actual chronograph runner itself, but in the process of filming this I got a little sidetracked and did them the wrong way around, because that can actually lead to that little washer lifting away on the oiler, and then you have to clean it and do it again if it does so. I was fortunate this time and it stayed in place for me. So with those two wheels together, we can then oil the pivot or the post rather, for the intermediate wheel, and this is the wheel that drives the minute wheel around as the chronograph wheel turns via the gear from the coupling clutch. Once they're all in place, we add a tiny amount of D5 onto, 9010 onto the tips of the tension springs, which hold the top faces of both chronograph wheels and the top of the intermediate wheel. And this is a simple friction fit on a post, and is a little fiddly, but with a bit of practice it's relatively straightforward. You'll see the shape of the cutout that goes over the post at the back there. So there's like a teardrop shape, and the larger section goes over the post. It then slides back, and the two tabs on either side spring down and hold it in place, and then the fingers sit on top of the chronograph wheels. Here I'm just checking the operation of the start, stop and reset buttons before fitting the driving gear to the extended fourth wheel pivot. That's put into place, and then that was secured down in place using a staking set. It's important to use something to drive these wheels straight on, because if you don't drive them straight you can bend the extended pivot of the fourth wheel. With the movement side completed, we can flip that over and assemble the cannon pinion, minute wheel and hour wheel. These are lubricated and simply dropped into place, remembering that the cannon pinion is a free cannon pinion on this, the tension being provided by the spring on the barrel, by the riveted wheel on the barrel lid rather. And the minute wheel, as you can see, is dropped into place after the post, and the ridge has a little oil applied, and then the hour wheel on top. We can then refit the cassette system, which operates the calendar disc, and it's important that you remember the orientation of this, because there are no obvious pointers as to how this refits, so you have to remember which orientation this goes in, and then with a little bit of wiggling there you can see around the cam we're just making sure that the gear for the calendar works meshes correctly. The calendar wheel can then be fitted over the top, and then the two stepped washers and screws are fitted, which hold both the calendar works and the calendar wheel in place. You can see that one's fighting me a little bit there. The design of the calendar mechanism is actually really clever, in the fact that it's all riveted to a single plate, because all of the components, while riveted to a single plate, are all very accessible in terms of being able to clean and lubricate them after fitting. It's a very clever design, really nice, and as yet I've never yet encountered one with parts that are so worn that it would require a part of the plate replacing or a replacement plate. so it's clearly a well tried and tested design. There you can see the quick set date, and here I'm just pointing out the various areas which require a little lubrication. So the lever for the date change, the cam, and the spring that holds the calendar wheel under tension. Once that's fitted and tested, we can refit the dial and its spacer ring. I'm just having a quick test to make sure that nothing's binding or catching before tightening up the dial feet screws, which are, as mentioned, the top hat type. And they're turned such that the skirt will bite into the dial feet and hold it in place. The fitting of the hands wasn't shown, but it's just your standard turn until the calendar changes date, set the hour and minute hands to midnight, and then set the running seconds hand as required, and then the chronograph is set with the reset pusher pressed, making sure that the hammers are firmly seated on the hearts, and then the minute recorder and hour recorder are set to the 12 o'clock position. And with this, the movement is cased, the casing ring is fitted, and the winding stem is refitted. This is a little bit fiddly because you have to undo the setting lever screw quite a bit more than you normally would with a conventional setting lever screw, as you can see there as I'm tightening it up. But once used to it, it's no more complicated than a conventional one. The watch is obviously then checked and regulated before the case back is refitted with a new gasket. And as you can see at this point, the bezel is yet to be refitted to the watch. And this is after cleaning the case. And there I'm just testing the start, stop and reset of the chronograph to make sure that nothing is catching in the case. And at this point I'm just popping the case back on prior to some testing being carried out before final regulation. And as mentioned earlier, you can actually restart this using the stop button, but it does have a sudden meshing problem where it tends to make it jump by about a second. But given that these weren't actually designed to do that, I think that's quite acceptable. And here we've got a little time lapse, and this is just running the chronograph for about 30 minutes or so to make sure it completes a full cycle of the sweep seconds and the minute recorder as the hour and minute hands are going around the dial to make sure that nothing catches or binds. And what I like to do with all chronographs with a subdial, a register, is to let it run for about 12 hours to make sure that we get a full rotation of the hour and minute hand all the way around the dial and the subdial. So that ends the reassembly portion of the Sicura. I also stand slightly corrected to an earlier statement I made that you can stop but not restart this, and you absolutely can't restart it with the start button. But something occurred to me during the reassembly which hadn't occurred to me previously, and that is that if you gently press the reset button, it actually clicks the coupling clutch back into position and begins to drive again. Now again, as you can see very clearly, when you do so, there's a noticeable jump of about a second. So, you know, for general timing, it would be okay. You're not going to do anything accurate, super accurate, like timing the Olympics, but for general timing duties, you know, bearing that in mind, you're going to be okay. And that's an interesting point to note, because I have a couple of 8420 chronograph watches myself, not quite as nice as this, and I have noticed also some slight differences on the escapement of this one versus the cheaper brands, or certainly the couple of brands that I have, which have a very rudimentary regulating system compared to this one. And also the shock system is more of a sort of KIF type system, whereas this is more of an Inca block type system. So as you can see, you start, you reset, and what have you is functioning. And as mentioned, you can stop and restart. Of course, if you press a bit too hard, it will automatically go back. Some people also, worth mentioning at this point, and just to point out, some people refer to these as a flyback chronograph, because you can press the reset while it's running and reset it to 0. Now, this is not actually a true flyback chronograph. I also have another watch which I hope to be featuring on my channel soon. It's one that I picked up for myself, and it's currently residing in my drawer of waiting to be done. And that's also often referred to as a flyback, and a similar sort of style to the Landeron 48. But again, it's not a true flyback, because while you can reset it without actually stopping it first, a true flyback will actually reset to 0 and then resume counting, start counting again as soon as you take your hand off the start button. Whereas with this particular one, once you press that, it just resets to 0, as you can see. So there we have it. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I wanted to show this one because it's just a particularly nice example. It's got a really nice dial. The crystal polished up well. It had some scuffs and scratches, but nothing too deep. So that polished up really nicely, as you can see. The dial is in really good condition, and overall it's just a lovely condition watch. So I hope you enjoyed these videos. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.